As the summer of 1944 began to fade into early autumn, the situation confronting the Allied forces in Western Europe had evolved into something paradoxical and deeply troubling. The triumphant landings at Normandy, which had taken place just months earlier in June, had been followed by a remarkable surge across the French countryside. American, British and Canadian forces had pushed inland with a speed and determination that exceeded even the most optimistic predictions from military planners. Towns and villages were liberated in rapid succession. The German army, which had controlled France for 4 long years, found itself in hasty retreat across broad stretches of territory. Victory seemed tantalizingly close, almost within reach. Yet beneath this veneer of military success, a crisis of unprecedented magnitude was quietly developing, one that threatened to transform the Allied triumph into a strategic catastrophe. The problem wasn't rooted in tactical failures on the battlefield. The soldiers weren't losing their nerve, and the German forces weren't mounting some devastating counterattack that was pushing the Allies backward. Instead, the crisis stemmed from something far more mundane, yet equally critical to the outcome of the war. The armies racing eastward toward the German border were literally running out of gas. Fuel tanks were approaching empty. Ammunition stocks were dwindling. Food supplies for the troops were becoming scarce. The mechanical lifeblood that kept a modern army moving and fighting was failing to reach the front lines in adequate quantities. Without fuel, the most powerful tank became nothing more than an immobile steel coffin. Without ammunition, the finest artillery piece was reduced to a useless hunk of metal. Without food, even the most determined soldiers would eventually collapse from exhaustion and hunger. General George Smith Patton, a commander whose aggressive tactics and relentless forward momentum had become legendary, watched in mounting frustration as his armoured divisions ground to a halt. These weren't tanks that had been knocked out by enemy fire or disabled by mechanical failure. These were perfectly functional fighting machines rendered completely useless by the absence of fuel in their tanks. Patton, a man not known for patience or restraint, understood with bitter clarity that every day his forces remained stationary was a day the German army could use to regroup, to establish new defensive positions, to bring up reinforcements, and to prepare for the battles yet to come. The window of opportunity to end the war quickly was closing, and it was closing because the logistics system had failed to keep pace with the remarkable speed of the advance. What emerged as the solution to this critical dilemma didn't come from some brilliant new weapons system or innovative battlefield tactic. It didn't involve the deployment of additional combat divisions or the execution of some daring flanking maneuver. Instead, salvation came from the unglamorous, often overlooked realm of military logistics. The answer materialized in the form of an around-the-clock trucking operation, a massive convoy system that would operate continuously without pause, ferrying supplies from the Normandy beaches to the advancing armies hundreds of miles to the east. This operation, which would come to be known by a name borrowed from railroad terminology, represented one of the most ambitious logistical undertakings in military history. The profound irony embedded in this solution, an irony that speaks volumes about American society in the middle of the 20th century, was that the overwhelming majority of the men who would execute this critical mission were African American soldiers. These were men who had volunteered to serve their country, who had put on the uniform and sworn an oath to defend the United States, yet who had been systematically excluded from combat roles due to the color of their skin. The military establishment of that era, reflecting the deeply segregated society from which it drew its personnel, had decided that these men were unsuitable for fighting, but perfectly acceptable for the hard, dangerous work of keeping the supply lines open. They could drive trucks through combat zones, they could risk their lives on dangerous roads under enemy fire, but they couldn't be trusted to serve alongside white soldiers in infantry or armoured units. This was the bitter reality of military service for African Americans during World War II, a reality that made their ultimate achievement all the more remarkable and historically significant. To truly comprehend why the situation in August of 1944 had become so desperate, you need to understand the complex logistics puzzle that the Allied command was frantically trying to solve. In many ways, the Allies had become victims of their own success. The Normandy invasion, which commenced on the 6th of June, had been a carefully planned operation that had required years of preparation. The initial objectives had been relatively modest and realistic. Military planners expected that it would take months of hard fighting just to secure a firm foothold in France and gradually expand the beachhead. The assumption was that the German defenders would fight tenaciously for every mile of French soil, that progress would be measured and methodical, and that it might take as long as 3 months just to reach the Seine River and secure Paris. Then came Operation Cobra, launched on the 25th of July, and everything changed. This offensive, spearheaded by the American First Army, managed to punch a hole through the German defensive lines in Normandy. The breakthrough was more successful than anyone had dared to hope. Once the American forces had broken into open country, General Patton's Third Army, which had been waiting for precisely this opportunity, burst through the gap and began racing across France at a pace that astounded friend and foe alike. Towns that the Germans had expected to defend for weeks fell in a matter of days or even hours. The German army in France, which had seemed so formidable just weeks earlier, began to disintegrate. Units retreated in confusion and disorder. Command structures broke down. What had been anticipated as a grinding war of attrition suddenly transformed into a pursuit operation, with Allied forces chasing a demoralized and disorganized enemy across the French countryside. Patton's armoured columns moved with breathtaking speed, sometimes covering 50 miles or more in a single day. This was mobile warfare at its finest, the kind of rapid exploitation of enemy weakness that military theorists had written about for decades. Tank crews barely had time to rest before they were pushing forward again. Infantry units rode on trucks to keep pace with the armour. The advance seemed unstoppable, and there was genuine optimism that the war in Europe might be concluded by the end of 1944, that Allied soldiers might be home for Christmas. German prisoners were being captured by the thousands. French civilians emerged from years of occupation to greet their liberators with flowers and wine and tears of joy. The momentum seemed irreversible. But momentum in warfare, like momentum in physics, requires constant energy input to maintain itself. And the energy that fueled this particular advance came in very concrete forms: gasoline for the tanks and trucks, diesel fuel for the transport vehicles, ammunition for the weapons, spare parts for the inevitable mechanical breakdowns, food rations for the soldiers, medical supplies for the wounded. A modern army in active operations consumes material at a rate that would seem almost incomprehensible to someone unfamiliar with military logistics. The numbers are staggering when you really think about them. A single infantry division engaged in sustained offensive operations required approximately 750 tons of supplies every single day. That's £1.5 million of material that had to be delivered daily to keep just one division functioning effectively. An armoured division, with its fuel-hungry tanks and other vehicles, needed roughly 350 tons of gasoline alone, not counting all the other supplies necessary to keep the division operational. Now multiply those figures by the number of divisions the Allies had in France. By late August of 1944, there were 28 Allied divisions actively engaged in the pursuit of German forces. The mathematical calculation becomes almost overwhelming. We're talking about tens of thousands of tons of supplies that needed to be transported every single day to keep this massive military machine running. And every mile that the armies advanced eastward made the problem exponentially more difficult because those supplies had to travel that much farther to reach the front lines. The supply situation was complicated by factors beyond just the distance involved. Prior to the invasion, Allied air forces had conducted a systematic and highly effective campaign to destroy the French railroad network. The strategic logic was sound. By wrecking railways, bridges, and marshalling yards, the Allies could prevent the Germans from rapidly moving reinforcements to Normandy to counter the invasion. This aerial interdiction campaign had worked brilliantly for its intended purpose. German units trying to reach the battle zone had to move slowly by road, exposed to constant air attack, arriving piecemeal and too late to affect the outcome. The destruction of the rail system had contributed significantly to the success of the invasion and the subsequent breakout. However, this success now created a severe problem for the Allies themselves. Those same destroyed railways that had prevented German reinforcement were now unavailable to support the Allied advance. The Allies couldn't simply repair them overnight. Bridges that had been bombed into rubble couldn't be quickly rebuilt. Rail yards that had been transformed into twisted metal couldn't be rapidly restored to operational status. The French rail network, which under normal circumstances would have been the primary means of moving large quantities of supplies inland from the coast, was essentially useless for the immediate future. The port situation added another layer of complexity to the logistics nightmare. Major French ports that could handle large ships and process thousands of tons of cargo efficiently were either still in German hands or had been so thoroughly destroyed by the retreating Germans that they were temporarily unusable. Cherbourg, the major port on the Cotentin Peninsula, had been captured by American forces, but the Germans had systematically wrecked the harbour facilities before withdrawing. The port couldn't handle anywhere near its pre-war capacity. Other significant ports were still under siege or remained in enemy possession. This meant that the vast majority of supplies for the Allied armies were still coming ashore over the invasion beaches in Normandy, using the temporary harbour facilities that had been constructed immediately after the landings. These artificial harbours, remarkable engineering achievements though they were, had never been designed to serve as the primary supply conduit for multiple armies conducting sustained offensive operations hundreds of miles inland. They were supposed to be a temporary expedient, used only until proper port facilities could be secured and brought back into operation. But circumstances had forced them into a role they were never meant to fill for such an extended period. Ships arrived offshore, unloaded their cargoes onto smaller craft, which then brought the supplies to the beaches. From there, everything had to be sorted, organised, and loaded onto trucks for the long journey to the front lines. It was a cumbersome, inefficient process that couldn't possibly keep up with the voracious appetite of 28 divisions racing across France. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, understood the gravity of the situation with perfect clarity. He observed that every mile gained by the advancing armies actually made the logistics problem worse, not better. The supply trucks had to drive farther to deliver their cargoes, which meant each round trip took longer, which meant fewer deliveries per truck per day, which meant the supply shortfall became progressively more severe. It was a vicious cycle with no easy solution. The armies needed to keep moving to maintain pressure on the Germans, but they couldn't move without fuel and ammunition, and getting fuel and ammunition to them was becoming increasingly difficult with every passing day. By the final week of August, the situation had deteriorated to the point of genuine crisis. Patton's Third Army, which had been the spearhead of the Allied advance, had reached the Meuse River, more than 200 miles from the nearest supply dumps in Normandy. The distance was simply too great for the available transportation assets to bridge effectively. Tanks that had been racing across France days earlier now sat motionless, their fuel tanks empty. Artillery batteries were rationing their ammunition carefully, unable to provide the kind of massive fire support that had characterized earlier operations. Infantry units were running low on everything from rifle ammunition to sea rations. The entire army, poised on the threshold of potentially decisive advances into Germany itself, was grinding to a halt not because the enemy had stopped them, but because their own supply system had broken down. Patton, never a man to hide his emotions or moderate his language, was absolutely furious. He understood military reality well enough to know that a stationary army is a vulnerable army. Every day his forces remained immobile was a day the Germans could use to recover from their defeats, to establish new defensive lines, to bring up reserves, to prepare obstacles and fortifications. The opportunity to end the war quickly was slipping away, and the reason had nothing to do with German military prowess or American tactical failures. It was purely a matter of logistics, of trucks and fuel, and the unglamorous but absolutely critical business of keeping supplies moving forward. In his characteristically blunt fashion, Patton declared that his biggest problem wasn't the German army, but rather his own supply chain's inability to keep his forces fueled and fighting. This unexpected pause in operations handed the German command a gift they desperately needed but didn't deserve. The German armies in France had been on the verge of complete collapse. Their losses in men and equipment had been catastrophic. Unit cohesion had broken down. Command and control was fragmentary at best. If the Allied advance had continued at its previous pace, there's a strong possibility that organised German resistance in France might have disintegrated completely, potentially shortening the war by months. Instead, the enforced halt gave the Germans precious time. They used it to pull back to more defensible positions, to reorganise shattered units, to establish new defensive lines, to begin preparing for what would become a winter campaign. The window of opportunity for a swift conclusion to the European war was closing, and it was closing because of supply trucks that couldn't drive fast enough or far enough to keep the armies moving. The Allied High Command recognised they were facing a crisis that could potentially negate all the gains achieved since June. Something dramatic had to be done, and it had to be done immediately. The solution they devised was born of desperation and necessity, a purely improvised response to an unexpected problem. If the railways couldn't move the supplies, then trucks would have to do it. Not the existing truck companies operating under normal peacetime-style regulations and schedules, but rather a massive, coordinated, round-the-clock trucking operation, unlike anything that had been attempted before in military history. This was the genesis of what would become known as the Red Ball Express. The men who would staff this critical operation, who would drive the trucks and maintain the vehicles and keep the supplies flowing, came from a segment of the American military that had been systematically marginalized and underutilized throughout the war. The story of African American military service during World War II is inextricably linked to the story of the Red Ball Express, because you cannot understand one without understanding the other. The military these men served in was not an integrated force that judged individuals solely on their merits and abilities. It was instead a rigidly segregated institution that reflected and reinforced the racial hierarchies of American society in the 1940s. Over 1 million African American men and women served in the United States military during World War II. That's a staggering number, representing an enormous contribution to the war effort. These were individuals who volunteered or were drafted into service, who took the oath, who put on the uniform, who were willing to risk their lives for their country. Yet from the moment they entered military service, they encountered a system designed to keep them separate and subordinate. The segregation wasn't subtle or informal. It was official policy, enforced at every level of the military hierarchy. African American soldiers trained at separate facilities from white soldiers. They were housed in separate barracks. They ate in separate mess halls. They used separate recreational facilities. In many southern training bases, they were even required to use separate medical facilities, as if somehow their blood or their illnesses were fundamentally different from those of white soldiers. This enforced separation extended beyond mere physical segregation. It reflected a deeper, more insidious assumption that permeated much of the military leadership: the belief that African American soldiers were inherently less capable, less courageous, less intelligent than their white counterparts. This racist ideology, which had absolutely no basis in fact, but was widely accepted among many senior officers, led to African Americans being systematically excluded from combat roles. The prevailing attitude was that they lacked the qualities necessary for frontline service, that they would panic under fire, that they couldn't be trusted in critical situations. As a consequence, the vast majority of African American soldiers were assigned to service and support units. They became the cooks who prepared meals for the army. They became the engineers who built roads and bridges. They became the stevedores who loaded and unloaded ships in ports around the world. They became the truck drivers who transported supplies. All of these roles were essential to military operations, absolutely critical to keeping the army functioning, but they weren't the roles these men had necessarily hoped to fill when they enlisted. Many African American soldiers had volunteered for service, hoping to serve in combat units, hoping to prove themselves on the battlefield, hoping to demonstrate conclusively that they possessed the same courage and capability as any other American soldier. Instead, they found themselves shunted into what the military euphemistically called service roles, essential jobs that nonetheless carried less prestige and offered fewer opportunities for advancement or recognition. The few African American officers who were commissioned typically found themselves prohibited from commanding white troops, regardless of their qualifications or abilities. The institutional racism was comprehensive and deeply embedded in the military's structure. This situation created a profound moral and psychological contradiction for African American service members. They were fighting in a war that was explicitly framed as a struggle for freedom and democracy against the forces of tyranny and oppression. President Roosevelt and other Allied leaders spoke eloquently about the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. These were presented as universal human rights that the Allies were fighting to defend and extend. Yet the African American soldiers who were supposed to be fighting for these freedoms didn't enjoy them fully themselves, either in civilian life back home or within the military itself. In the American South, where many African Americans lived and where many training bases were located, Jim Crow laws enforced strict racial segregation in every aspect of daily life. African Americans couldn't eat at the same restaurants as whites, couldn't stay in the same hotels, couldn't use the same public facilities, couldn't even drink from the same water fountains. They faced discrimination in employment, in housing, in education, in voting rights. The irony of fighting against Nazi racial ideology while experiencing racial oppression at home was not lost on African American service members or their families and communities. This contradiction gave rise to what became known as the Double V campaign, a concept that originated in African American newspapers and communities. The Double V stood for two victories that African Americans sought to achieve simultaneously: victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. The campaign recognized that military service represented not just an obligation, but also an opportunity. By serving with distinction, by proving their courage and competence, by demonstrating their full commitment to the American cause, African American soldiers hoped to earn the respect and equal treatment that had been denied to them. They hoped that their wartime sacrifices would translate into greater civil rights and social equality in the post-war period. For many African American soldiers, then, military service carried a deeper significance than it did for their white counterparts. They weren't just fighting against Germany and Japan. They were fighting for their own place in American society, for recognition of their full humanity and citizenship, for the rights that should have been theirs by birth but had been systematically withheld. Their service was an act of patriotism, certainly, but it was also an act of protest and of hope, a way of saying that they belonged, that they deserved better, that they would no longer accept second-class status. It was from this pool of often overlooked and undervalued personnel, primarily from quartermaster units and other service branches, that the military would draw the drivers and support staff for the Red Ball Express. These were men who had been told they weren't good enough for combat, but who would now be asked to perform one of the most critical and dangerous missions of the entire European campaign. The irony was profound and bitter, but these soldiers would embrace the challenge and prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the racist assumptions underlying their exclusion from combat roles were utterly baseless. The planning for the Red Ball Express took place in an atmosphere of barely controlled panic at Allied headquarters. Senior logistics officers worked virtually around the clock for 36 intense hours, developing a plan that could address the supply crisis before it became completely catastrophic. The concept they developed was audacious in its simplicity and staggering in its scale. Since the railway network was unavailable and would remain so for the foreseeable future, they would create a highway-based supply system that would function like a railway, with one-way traffic moving in each direction along designated routes, operating continuously 24 hours a day without pause. The name Red Ball Express came from railroad terminology. In the freight industry, particularly urgent shipments were marked with a red ball symbol to indicate that they had absolute priority and should be expedited by any means necessary. Everything else had to yield to red ball freight. It was the perfect name for this operation, because speed and priority were everything. The supplies sitting in Normandy were urgeless there. They only had value once they reached the soldiers who needed them at the front lines, and getting them there as quickly as possible was the entire purpose of the operation. The operational plan called for designated routes across France to be marked and reserved exclusively for red ball traffic. Other military vehicles, supply convoys operating on different schedules, even ambulances in some cases, would have to use alternate routes or wait for red ball convoys to pass. One route would carry loaded trucks moving east toward the front lines. A parallel route would carry empty trucks returning west to the supply depots to pick up another load. This one-way system was designed to maximize efficiency and minimize delays caused by traffic jams or vehicles trying to pass each other on narrow French roads. Military police detachments were assigned to every major intersection, every town along the route, every point where traffic might potentially slow down or get confused. Their orders were simple and unambiguous. Keep the red ball trucks moving. Don't let them stop unless absolutely necessary. Don't let other traffic interfere with them. Red ball trucks had absolute priority over everything else. The routes themselves were clearly marked with signs bearing the red ball symbol, making it impossible for drivers to get lost or confused about where they were supposed to go. The scale of the operation, when you look at the actual numbers, was truly breathtaking. When the Red Ball Express officially commenced operations on the 25th of August, 1944, it involved thousands of trucks and tens of thousands of men. At its operational peak, nearly 6,000 trucks were on the roads simultaneously, moving in an endless stream toward the combat zones. To staff this operation, to provide the drivers and mechanics and support personnel necessary to keep it running, the Army had to scrape together personnel from wherever they could be found. Clerks were pulled from offices and put behind the wheel of trucks. Cooks were taken from mess halls and assigned to driving duties. Mechanics, at least, were doing work related to their training, but many others had never driven anything larger than a passenger car before being told they would now be operating 2.5-ton cargo trucks on a daily basis. Approximately 75% of the 23,000 soldiers assigned to the Red Ball Express were African American. This percentage reflected both the concentration of African American personnel in service units and the military's willingness to assign them to difficult, dangerous work, even while excluding them from combat roles. Many of these men were young, in their late teens or early 20s, facing responsibilities they had never imagined when they enlisted. They would have to learn quickly or fail, and failure was not an option the Allied command could accept. The vehicle that would become the workhorse of the entire operation, the machine that these young drivers would have to master, was the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo truck, universally known throughout the military as the Deuce and a Half. This truck represented American industrial capability at its finest. It was rugged, relatively reliable, and capable of operating under conditions that would have disabled more delicate vehicles. The Deuce and a Half had a 6-cylinder engine, 4-wheel drive for better traction on poor roads, and a cargo bed that could theoretically hold 2.5 tons of supplies. However, theoretically and actually were two very different things in the context of the Red Ball Express. The official cargo capacity was treated more as a suggestion than as a limit. Trucks were routinely loaded with 4, 5, even 6 tons of supplies, far exceeding what they were designed to carry. The urgency of the situation meant that maximizing the cargo on each truck was considered more important than adhering to manufacturer specifications or safety limits. Additionally, many trucks pulled trailers, further increasing their effective cargo capacity. When you calculate the maximum theoretical hauling capacity of the Red Ball Express at its peak, with 6,000 trucks each carrying an average operational load of 5 tons, you arrive at a staggering 30,000 tons that could potentially be in transit at any given moment. Despite its capabilities, the Deuce and a Half was not an easy or comfortable vehicle to operate. The cab offered minimal protection from the elements. There was no heater for cold weather. The seats were basic and offered little cushioning against the constant vibration and jarring from rough roads. The suspension was stiff, designed for durability rather than comfort, which meant that every pothole and bump was transmitted directly to the driver and his body. The engine was loud, making conversation difficult and contributing to driver fatigue. The steering was heavy, requiring considerable physical strength to maneuver, especially when the truck was fully loaded. These were working machines, not passenger vehicles, and the men who drove them would quickly become intimately familiar with every quirk and characteristic of these trucks. The inaugural Red Ball route stretched over 300 miles, from the supply depots near the Normandy beaches to forward distribution points in the vicinity of Paris and beyond. 300 miles might not sound like an enormous distance by modern highway standards, but these weren't modern highways. These were narrow French country roads, many of them dating back decades or even centuries, roads that had never been designed to accommodate the kind of heavy, continuous traffic that the Red Ball Express would generate. Moreover, these roads had been damaged by years of war, by bombing, by the passage of German military vehicles, by the recent Allied advance. Potholes were common, road surfaces were often broken or degraded. Bridge weight limits were frequently exceeded by the heavily loaded American trucks. Official military regulations specified maximum speeds, required distances between vehicles in convoy, and mandatory rest periods for drivers. In theory, these regulations were supposed to ensure safe operations and prevent accidents. In practice, as the demands of the war intensified and the urgency of getting supplies forward became ever more critical, these rules were increasingly treated as flexible guidelines rather than rigid requirements. Drivers learned to bend or ignore regulations when they felt it was necessary to complete their missions. The unofficial motto of the Red Ball Express, borrowed from French, was tout de suite, meaning right now or immediately. This phrase captured the essential character of the operation better than any official military directive ever could. One Red Ball driver, recalling those days years later, put it succinctly when he described what his commanding officer had told him. The instruction was simple: eat when you can, sleep when you can, but above all else, drive. Keep the trucks moving. Keep the supplies flowing. Everything else was secondary to that primary mission. And drive they did, in conditions that would seem unimaginable to anyone accustomed to modern trucking operations. The Red Ball Express operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without pause. There were no days off, no regular schedules, no predictable routines. When a truck was loaded, it departed. When it reached its destination and was unloaded, it turned around and headed back for another load. The cycle was endless and relentless. A complete round trip from the Normandy coast to the forward supply points and back again could easily require 54 hours or more of driving time. That's more than 2 full days and nights behind the wheel, navigating unfamiliar roads, dealing with mechanical problems, coping with weather conditions, all while fighting off the exhaustion that inevitably comes from such extended periods of concentration and physical effort. To make this even remotely sustainable, most trucks operated with 2-man crews. While one driver controlled the vehicle, his partner was supposed to rest in the passenger seat, trying to sleep so that he could take over driving duties when the first man became too exhausted to continue safely. Anyone who has ever tried to sleep in a moving vehicle, especially one as uncomfortable as a Deuce and a Half, knows how difficult that can be. The constant noise from the engine made sleep difficult. The harsh ride, with every bump and irregularity in the road transmitted through the stiff suspension directly to the cab, made rest almost impossible. The passenger seat, with its minimal padding and basic construction, offered little comfort. Yet the drivers had no choice but to try, because the alternative was to keep driving until they literally collapsed from exhaustion, which was dangerous for everyone involved. Despite their best efforts to rest while off duty, Many drivers found themselves operating their vehicles in states of extreme fatigue that would be considered criminally negligent under normal circumstances. They drove when they could barely keep their eyes open, when their vision became blurred and unreliable, when they were so tired that they were essentially functioning on autopilot and instinct rather than conscious attention. One driver remembered years later that there were times when he could barely see the road ahead, when his eyes refused to focus properly, when he was navigating more by feel than by sight, learning to sense the road surface and the vehicle's position through the steering wheel and the sound of the tyres. To combat this dangerous level of exhaustion, drivers developed various strategies and techniques, most of which would seem desperate or pathetic to an outside observer, but which were simply necessary survival tactics under the circumstances. They would splash cold water on their faces at every opportunity, trying to shock themselves back to alertness. They would sing loudly, sometimes entire songs, or even just repeated phrases, using the mental activity and the sound of their own voices to keep their minds engaged. They would slap themselves, pinch themselves, do anything they could think of to maintain consciousness and avoid the deadly temptation to close their eyes for just a moment. Some drivers chewed coffee grounds or tobacco, anything to provide a stimulant effect. The struggle against sleep was constant and exhausting in itself, a battle that had to be won repeatedly, hour after hour, throughout each long journey. The roads themselves presented dangers that went beyond mere fatigue. The French road network, even in peacetime, consisted largely of narrow country roads that had been built for light traffic and moderate speeds. These roads had not been designed to handle thousands of heavily loaded trucks passing over them day and night. The war had damaged them further. Allied bombing, German military traffic during the occupation, and the recent passage of Allied armies had all taken their toll on road surfaces. Pavement was cracked and broken in many places. Potholes could be enormous, easily large enough to damage or destroy a truck's suspension or blow out a tyre. Road shoulders, where drivers might normally pull off in case of trouble, were often unstable and unable to support the weight of a fully loaded truck. Driving at night presented its own unique set of challenges and hazards. To reduce the risk of enemy air attack, strict blackout procedures were enforced. Trucks were prohibited from using their normal headlights, which would have made them visible to German aircraft that might still be operating in the area. Instead, drivers were required to navigate using only blackout lights, tiny slits of illumination no bigger than a small coin, barely sufficient to see the road directly in front of the truck, utterly inadequate for normal night driving at any speed. Operating an overloaded truck at 30 or 40 miles per hour on a dark, damaged road, using only those minimal lights, required extraordinary skill, nerve, and more than a little luck. Many drivers, faced with this impossible situation, made a calculated decision to violate the blackout regulations when they felt it was absolutely necessary. They would briefly switch on their full headlights to navigate particularly difficult sections of road, hoping desperately that no German night fighter happened to be overhead at that moment. It was a risk, certainly, but so was driving blind on a dangerous road with 5 tons of cargo behind you. These were the kinds of impossible choices that Red Bull drivers had to make constantly, balancing one danger against another, trying to complete their missions while staying alive. The danger wasn't limited to accidents and fatigue, however. Despite the general German retreat, the Allied advance had not completely cleared all enemy forces from the areas through which the Red Bull Express operated. Small units of German soldiers, bypassed by the rapid Allied advance, remained behind enemy lines. Some were simply trying to evade capture and make their way back to German-held territory. Others had been deliberately left behind as stay-behind forces, with orders to disrupt Allied supply lines through sabotage and harassment. These soldiers operated as snipers and raiders, targeting vulnerable supply convoys. Red Bull convoys, moving along predictable routes on regular schedules, were tempting targets. A truck loaded with ammunition was particularly valuable to attack, since a single well-placed shot could cause a catastrophic explosion that would destroy multiple vehicles and kill or wound many men. The threat of ambush was constant, especially on isolated stretches of road or when passing through wooded areas that could conceal enemy soldiers. Drivers had to maintain constant vigilance, watching the roadside and the surrounding terrain for any sign of danger, all while maintaining their position in the convoy and keeping their trucks moving forward. The possibility of encountering mines was another ever-present concern. German forces, both during their initial occupation and during their recent retreat, had laid minefields to protect key positions and to delay pursuing Allied forces. Some of these minefields had been cleared, but many had not. There was always the possibility that a road that seemed safe might actually be mined, that the next truck in the convoy might trigger an explosion. To provide at least some minimal protection against this threat, many drivers placed sandbags on the floors of their cabs. The theory was that if the truck hit a mine, the sandbags might absorb some of the blast force and potentially save the driver's life, or at least reduce the severity of his injuries. It was a crude expedient, but it was better than nothing, and it gave the drivers at least some small sense of control over their fate. Even the air wasn't completely safe, despite Allied air superiority over France. While the Luftwaffe had been largely driven from the skies by this point in the war, lone German aircraft occasionally managed to penetrate Allied air defences, and a convoy of trucks travelling along an open road made an attractive target for a strafing run. A single German fighter bomber could potentially destroy or damage dozens of trucks in a matter of minutes, turning a supply convoy into a line of burning wrecks. The drivers had no defence against air attack except to keep moving and hope that they weren't spotted or that Allied fighters would intercept any enemy aircraft before they could press home an attack. The hazardous nature of the work meant that mechanical breakdowns, which would have been a mere inconvenience under normal circumstances, became serious problems on the Red Ball Express. When a truck broke down on the route, it couldn't simply sit and wait for a tow truck to arrive at some leisurely pace. The Red Ball routes needed to be kept clear. Disabled trucks that blocked traffic represented a crisis that had to be resolved immediately. Other drivers, passing a broken-down vehicle, would often stop to help, even if it meant delaying their own deliveries. They would share parts, offer tools, work together to get the disabled truck running again, if at all possible. If a truck was damaged beyond immediate repair, it would be quickly cannibalized. Other drivers would strip useful parts from it, taking anything they might need to keep their own trucks running. Spare tires, batteries, belts, hoses, anything that might be useful would be taken, leaving behind only the truck's worthless shell. The mechanics assigned to the Red Ball Express became remarkably skilled at performing rapid field repairs under primitive conditions. They worked outdoors, often by the side of the road, using whatever tools and parts were available, fixing trucks that by rights should have been sent back to proper repair facilities. They improvised solutions to problems, fabricating replacement parts when proper parts weren't available, doing whatever was necessary to get trucks back on the road. Their ingenuity and dedication were every bit as important to the success of the operation as the courage of the drivers. Despite all these challenges and dangers, despite the exhaustion and the fear and the constant stress, something remarkable developed among the men of the Red Ball Express. A powerful sense of solidarity and mutual dependence grew up among these soldiers who had been brought together by institutional racism and military necessity. They relied on each other completely. Your life might depend on the driver behind you keeping proper distance so he didn't rear-end you if you had to brake suddenly. Your survival might depend on another driver stopping to help when your truck broke down in a dangerous area. This mutual dependence created bonds of trust and friendship that transcended the usual military relationships. Yet even in this environment, even among men who were literally risking their lives together in service of a common mission, the poison of racial prejudice remained a constant and bitter presence. The combat troops at the front lines, the soldiers whose lives depended on receiving the supplies that the Red Ball Express delivered, didn't care about the race of the men driving the trucks. They welcomed anyone who brought them ammunition and fuel and food. In the front lines, where survival was the only thing that mattered, the colour of a supply driver's skin was completely irrelevant. But in the rear areas, away from the immediate danger of combat, racism remained as virulent as ever. African American drivers frequently encountered harassment and discriminatory treatment from white military police, from white soldiers in rear echelon units, from white officers who commanded support facilities. These were the same men who had just driven for 2 days straight through dangerous territory to deliver critical supplies, who had risked their lives to keep the army supplied, who had worked until they were ready to collapse from exhaustion. Yet when they stopped for a brief rest, when they tried to get a meal or use a latrine or simply take a break from the relentless pressure of driving, they were often treated with contempt and hostility, reminded in countless petty and not-so-petty ways that they were considered inferior. This treatment was a constant, bitter reminder of the Double V campaign, of the fact that these men were fighting 2 wars simultaneously. On the road, delivering supplies to the front, they were valued and appreciated. In the rear areas, dealing with the military bureaucracy and the prejudices of some of their fellow soldiers, they were reminded that they were still second-class citizens in their own country's army. The psychological cost of this treatment was enormous, adding an additional burden to men who were already carrying more than should have been asked of any soldiers. The impact of the Red Ball Express on the broader war effort was immediate, dramatic, and absolutely crucial to Allied success. That immense river of supplies flowing eastward, carried by thousands of trucks operating around the clock, successfully broke the logistics logjam that had threatened to paralyze the Allied advance. For 83 consecutive days, from the 25th of August to the 16th of November, 1944, the Red Ball Express maintained its grueling schedule. The statistics compiled during those 83 days tell a story of logistical achievement that has rarely, if ever, been matched in military history. At its operational peak, the Red Ball Express was delivering approximately 12,500 tons of supplies every single day to the forward combat zones. 12,500 tons is 25 million pounds, an almost incomprehensible quantity of material. Over the entire 83-day period of operations, the Red Ball Express transported more than 400,000 tons of critical supplies. That's more than 800 million pounds of ammunition, gasoline, diesel fuel, food rations, medical supplies, spare parts, and everything else an army needs to function effectively. Every pound of that material had to be loaded onto trucks in Normandy, driven hundreds of miles across France on dangerous roads, and delivered to the units that needed it. This sustained infusion of supplies enabled General Patton's Third Army to resume its offensive operations and maintain pressure on the retreating German forces. One tank crew member, recalling those days decades later, stated plainly that without the Red Ball Express, his unit would have been completely immobilized. He remembered that the drivers were mostly African American, that they brought the supplies forward even while under the threat of enemy fire, that the tank crews would wait anxiously for their arrival, knowing that without the fuel and ammunition they carried, the tanks were useless. This testimony from a combat soldier puts into perspective just how critical the Red Ball Express was to military operations. The success of the Red Ball Express stood in stark and telling contrast to German logistics capabilities. The German military, despite its historical reputation for speed and mobility in offensive operations, was still heavily dependent on railways and horse-drawn transport for much of its logistical support. The same Allied aerial campaign that had destroyed the French railways and created the initial Allied supply crisis had an even more devastating effect on German logistics. The Germans, lacking anything comparable to the massive motorized supply system that the Americans had created, simply couldn't match the rate at which the Allies could bring forward supplies and reinforcements. The psychological impact of the Red Ball Express on German soldiers shouldn't be underestimated either. The deep, constant rumble of thousands of truck engines, audible for miles, became a characteristic sound of the Allied advance. German soldiers, hearing that endless mechanical thunder, understood what it meant. An enemy with seemingly unlimited resources, with the industrial capacity to maintain massive supply operations even in the middle of a war, with the ability to keep armies supplied and fighting even hundreds of miles from their bases. It was the sound of a nation whose productive capacity the Germans simply couldn't hope to match, and it was profoundly demoralizing to soldiers who were already facing defeat. The Red Ball Express proved conclusively that in modern warfare, logistics isn't merely a supporting function or an afterthought. Logistics is strategy. The most brilliant tactical plans, the most inspired operational concepts, the most courageous soldiers, all become irrelevant if the army runs out of fuel and ammunition. Conversely, an army that can maintain its supply lines, that can keep its forces fed and fueled and armed, that can move material efficiently from ports to fighting positions, possesses an enormous advantage that can compensate for other deficiencies. The United States demonstrated during the Red Ball Express that it had mastered the art and science of military logistics at a level that no other nation could match at that time. Even General Patton, who had initially been furious about the supply situation that had halted his advance, came to recognize and praise the contribution of the Red Ball Express. He publicly acknowledged that without the drivers and the supplies they delivered, his army couldn't have continued its operations. For a general known for his combative personality and his focus on offensive action, to praise a logistics operation so highly was remarkable and spoke volumes about just how critical the Red Ball Express had been. The Red Ball Express had always been conceived as a temporary emergency measure, not as a permanent solution to the Allied supply problem. Allied engineers had been working furiously throughout the late summer and autumn of 1944 to restore the French railway system to operational status and to bring major port facilities back online. By mid-November, these efforts had finally borne fruit. Sufficient portions of the French rail network had been repaired to allow regular train service carrying supplies from the coast to forward depots. More significantly, the major port of Antwerp in Belgium had finally been secured and cleared of German demolitions and mines. Antwerp was a prize of enormous strategic value. It was one of the largest and most modern ports in Europe, with facilities capable of handling dozens of ships simultaneously and processing tens of thousands of tons of cargo every day. Its location was also favourable, much closer to the German border than the Normandy beaches, which meant supplies landing at Antwerp had a much shorter journey to reach frontline units. Once Antwerp became fully operational, the pressure on the trucking system eased dramatically. The railways and maritime shipping could now handle the bulk of the logistics burden, carrying the vast majority of supplies needed by the Allied armies. With these more permanent and efficient supply systems finally in place, the Red Ball Express was no longer essential. On November 16, 1944, after 83 days of continuous operations, the Red Ball Express was officially deactivated. The trucks stopped rolling. The drivers, exhausted but carrying with them a tremendous sense of accomplishment, were reassigned to their regular units. The highways of France, which had echoed with the sound of truck engines day and night for nearly 3 months, fell quiet. But the story of the Red Ball Express didn't end with its deactivation. Its legacy, both in military terms and in broader historical and social terms, would prove to be far more significant and lasting than the immediate operational results. In the realm of military science and logistics studies, the Red Ball Express became a legendary case study, analysed and discussed in military academies and staff colleges around the world. It demonstrated that large-scale, long-distance trucking operations could be organised and sustained even under combat conditions, that motor transport could partially substitute for rail transport when necessary, and that the organisational and industrial capacity of the United States was capable of achievements that seemed impossible to other nations. The fact that the United States Army could, on very short notice and in the middle of an active campaign, organise and deploy a 6,000-truck operation staffed by tens of thousands of soldiers and maintain that operation continuously for nearly 3 months was a demonstration of logistics capability that impressed even Germany's military leadership, who had previously considered themselves expert in mobile warfare. German officers studying the Allied campaign after the war consistently pointed to American logistics superiority as one of the key factors in their defeat. The Red Ball Express became a symbol of that superiority, proof that the United States could project and sustain military power on a scale that simply couldn't be matched. However, the military significance of the Red Ball Express, important as it was, pales in comparison to its social and historical importance. The most profound and lasting impact of the Red Ball Express related not to logistics or military strategy, but to the issue of race relations in the American military and, by extension, in American society as a whole. The performance of the thousands of African American soldiers who formed the backbone of the Red Ball Express operation provided powerful, undeniable evidence that comprehensively refuted the racist assumptions that had been used to justify their exclusion from combat roles and their relegation to service positions. The racist ideology that pervaded much of the military establishment in 1944 held that African American soldiers lacked courage, that they would panic under fire, that they couldn't be trusted in dangerous situations, that they were suitable only for menial labor under the supervision of white officers. The Red Ball Express demolished every one of these assumptions. These supposedly timid soldiers had driven through combat zones, had continued operating even under the threat of enemy fire, had maintained their missions despite facing dangers that would have tested any soldier regardless of race. These supposedly incapable soldiers had mastered the operation of heavy trucks under the most challenging conditions imaginable, had kept the vehicles running despite mechanical problems and inadequate maintenance facilities, had navigated damaged roads in darkness using minimal lights, had done everything asked of them and done it superbly. The performance of the Red Ball Express drivers and support personnel was so clearly outstanding, so obviously professional and effective, that it became impossible for reasonable people to continue believing the racist myths that had previously been used to justify segregation and discrimination. Combat soldiers who had been saved from disaster by the timely arrival of Red Ball convoys didn't care about the race of the drivers. They cared that the supplies arrived when needed. Senior officers who had watched the operation function smoothly for months couldn't honestly claim that African American soldiers were incapable or unreliable. General Eisenhower himself, the Supreme Allied Commander, issued a formal message of thanks and recognition to the Red Ball Express personnel, acknowledging that their dedication and effectiveness had been crucial to the success of the Allied campaign. Coming from the highest levels of military command, this recognition carried enormous weight. Other African American units that were eventually allowed to serve in combat roles, including infantry companies that fought in the Battle of the Bulge and tank battalions that served with distinction, provided additional evidence that African American soldiers could perform any military function as effectively as soldiers of any other race. This accumulation of evidence gradually made the official policy of military segregation increasingly indefensible. If African American soldiers could drive supplies through combat zones with distinction, could fight effectively in infantry units, could operate tanks and artillery, could perform any military task as well as anyone else, then what possible justification existed for maintaining separate units and denying them opportunities based solely on race? The logic of segregation depended on assumptions of inferior capability, and those assumptions had been proven completely false by the performance of units like the Red Ball Express. It would take several more years before the military officially changed its policies. President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in July of 1948, officially ordering the integration of the United States Armed Forces. The implementation of that order took additional time, and full integration wasn't achieved overnight. But the groundwork for that change, the evidence that made segregation indefensible, had been laid in part by the Red Ball Express and similar units. Their exceptional performance had demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that military segregation was based on prejudice rather than on any genuine difference in capability. The broader impact on American society took even longer to manifest, but was perhaps even more significant. The African American soldiers who had served in the Red Ball Express returned home after the war to an America that still maintained segregation in much of the country, that still denied them basic civil rights, that still treated them as second-class citizens despite their military service. These men had risked their lives for their country, had performed essential work under conditions of extreme danger and hardship, had helped win a war against tyranny and oppression. Yet they came home to find themselves still subject to Jim Crow laws, still denied the right to vote in many areas, still facing discrimination in employment and housing and education. This profound injustice, the gap between the ideals these men had fought for and the reality they faced at home, provided a powerful impetus for the civil rights movement that would emerge in the 1950s and gain momentum in the 1960s. Veterans of the Red Ball Express and other African American military units became leaders in their communities, using their wartime experiences as proof that they deserved equal treatment. The Double V campaign, the fight for victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home, continued on American soil long after the war in Europe had ended. The story of the Red Ball Express is ultimately a story about many things, about logistics and military operations, about industrial capability and organizational skill, about courage and endurance under impossible conditions. But at its heart, it's a story about human beings who were systematically underestimated and discriminated against, yet who rose to meet an extraordinary challenge and performed with a level of excellence that couldn't be denied or dismissed. These soldiers proved that dedication and capability have nothing to do with race, that given the opportunity and the tools, people will rise to meet whatever challenges confront them. The roads of France that the Red Ball Express travelled are still there, though they've been rebuilt and modernised many times since 1944. The trucks, those thousands of 2.5 workhorses, have long since been scrapped or consigned to museums. The men who drove those trucks, who kept them running, who made the entire operation work, are now passing from living memory, with fewer veterans surviving with each passing year. But the legacy of what they accomplished remains vitally important. It reminds us that heroism comes in many forms, that the unglamorous work of logistics can be just as critical as the glory of combat, that prejudice and discrimination are not just morally wrong but practically foolish, since they prevent us from recognizing and utilizing the talents of all people regardless of their background. The Red Ball Express stands as one of the great logistical achievements in military history and as a powerful testament to what people can accomplish when given the chance to prove themselves. Those 83 days in the late summer and autumn of 1944, when thousands of trucks rolled day and night across the roads of France, when exhausted drivers pushed themselves beyond what should have been the limits of human endurance, when mechanics worked miracles to keep the vehicles running, represented a crucial turning point not just in the Second World War, but in the long struggle for civil rights and human dignity in America. The story deserves to be remembered, studied, and honoured, not as a quaint historical footnote, but as a central chapter in understanding both how wars are won and how societies can begin to overcome their deepest prejudices and move toward justice.